General Franz Halder had spent years convincing himself that Adolf Hitler's strange behavior was just part of the pressure of war, or maybe even a sign of unconventional genius. But on July 23, 1942, everything changed. Standing frozen in the conference room at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, Halder watched something that made his blood run cold. Hitler wasn't just angry or fanatical anymore. He was unhinged. The carefully crafted plans for Case Blue, Germany's summer offensive against the Soviet Union, lay torn to shreds on the floor. Hitler had ripped them up and replaced them with his own contradictory orders that defied every principle of military strategy Halder had learned in 4 decades of service. But it wasn't the reckless strategy that stopped him. It was the look in Hitler's eyes. His face was purple with rage, spittle flying as he screamed at his generals. His hands trembled violently, his left leg shook uncontrollably, and his pupils were wide and dilated, likely from the methamphetamine injections his personal doctor gave him daily. Hitler ranted about Jewish conspiracies, generals lacking willpower, destiny, and providence. This wasn't just anger or fanaticism. It was madness, clinical and undeniable. Halder had spent 2 years making excuses for Hitler's erratic behavior, telling himself it was stress or some kind of brilliance no one else could understand. But in that moment, watching the Führer foam at the mouth while ordering the Wehrmacht to attack in 2 opposite directions with too few troops for either, Halder finally accepted the truth. Germany was being led by a lunatic. This realization didn't come suddenly to most German generals. It crept in slowly, through a series of strange orders and decisions that seemed odd on their own, but, when pieced together, revealed a mind completely detached from reality. For years, the generals had tried to rationalize Hitler's behavior, hoping it was just a phase or a tactic. But by mid-1942, denial was no longer possible. Halder's shock was shared by many of his peers, though each had their own moment of clarity. Some saw it in the reckless no-retreat orders that doomed entire divisions. Others in the delusional belief that racial ideology could replace logistics and strategy. But for Halder, it was that July day, standing in the Wolf's Lair, watching the Führer unravel before his eyes, that marked the end of any illusions. Despite this, Halder didn't act. Fear, loyalty, and the terrifying power Hitler held over his subordinates kept him silent. He continued to serve a man he knew was mad, even as the consequences of that madness began to destroy Germany's chances in the war. The question haunted Halder for the rest of his life. Why hadn't he done more when he first saw the truth? But the answer was complicated. It wasn't just fear or loyalty. It was the slow, painful process of accepting that the man leading Germany wasn't a strategic genius or a ruthless leader, but someone who had lost touch with reality and was dragging an entire nation down with him. And this was only the beginning. What happened next would reveal even darker depths of Hitler's madness and the devastating impact it had on the war. By the bitter winter of 1941, the brutal reality of the Eastern Front was impossible to ignore. German armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow, but the tide was turning fast. The Soviet counterattacks were fierce, and the freezing cold was merciless. It was in this desperate moment that Field Marshal Fedor von Bock faced a decision that would expose the deadly consequences of Hitler's unraveling mind. Von Bock commanded Army Group Center, responsible for holding a vast and overstretched front line. His troops were exhausted, poorly equipped for the harsh winter, and dangerously vulnerable. Recognizing the dire situation, von Bock requested permission to conduct tactical withdrawals, small, strategic retreats to shorten his lines, regroup, and preserve his forces. It was a standard military move designed to save lives and maintain a fighting chance. But Hitler's response was chilling. Delivered by teleprinter, the order was clear and absolute. There would be no retreat. Troops were to hold their positions at all costs, even if the enemy broke through their flanks or rear. Commanders who disobeyed would face court-martial and execution. The message was brutal and unforgiving. No mercy, no flexibility, no room for common sense. Von Bock read the order 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. This wasn't military strategy. It was a death sentence. Entire divisions were being ordered to stand their ground without winter gear, ammunition, or food in temperatures plunging to -40 degrees. The order guaranteed catastrophic losses, but Hitler's fanaticism left no room for compromise. Von Bock protested, carefully explaining that the order would lead to needless slaughter without any strategic gain. But his words fell on deaf ears. Hitler dismissed his concerns and relieved him of command, replacing him with officers who would carry out the insane orders without question. What made this moment even more disturbing wasn't just the no-retreat command itself, it was the ideology behind it. Hitler believed that the Soviet resistance would collapse because Slavic peoples were racially inferior and incapable of sustained military effort. When von Bock pointed out that Soviet forces had just recaptured key cities, inflicting massive casualties, Hitler waved it off as the work of disloyal generals sabotaging the war effort. This wasn't just stubbornness or propaganda. It was a complete detachment from reality. Hitler's racial ideology had become a filter through which he ignored facts and evidence. When reality clashed with his beliefs, he chose to dismiss reality altogether. For von Bock, this was the moment when denial became impossible. Hitler wasn't just making reckless decisions. He was living in a fantasy world where ideology trumped logic and entire armies were sacrificed for the sake of a twisted vision. The consequences were devastating. German units trapped behind enemy lines were left to be destroyed. Soldiers froze and starved, ordered to hold positions that were militarily untenable. The no-retreat order turned the Eastern Front into a slaughterhouse, bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. Von Bock's fate was a warning to other generals. Questioning Hitler's orders meant losing everything. Yet, even as the war spiraled out of control, many officers continued to follow commands, trapped by fear, loyalty, or the hope that somehow the madness would end. But it wouldn't. The no-retreat order was just one of many signs that Hitler's grip on reality was slipping. And the cost of that slip would be paid in blood, and this was far from the only time Hitler's delusions would doom his commanders and their men. What came next would reveal even deeper layers of denial and destruction. By early 1943, the grim reality of Germany's war machine was impossible to ignore, especially for General Heinz Guderian, the Wehrmacht's most brilliant panzer commander. Known for his sharp mind and innovative tactics, Guderian had been recalled from disgrace to rebuild Germany's armored forces after devastating losses at Stalingrad and in North Africa. But what he discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. Guderian's task was clear: assess the state of tank production and losses, then plan how to restore the panzer divisions to fighting strength. The numbers he uncovered were terrifying. Germany was producing roughly 600 tanks each month. But on the Eastern Front alone, the Wehrmacht was losing about 800 tanks every month. This didn't even include losses in North Africa, Italy, or from relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The math was simple and brutal. Germany was losing more tanks than it could replace. The armored forces were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Without a drastic change in strategy, the panzer divisions would be wiped out completely. Guderian presented these findings to Hitler on March 21, 1943, expecting a serious discussion about the need to shift to a defensive posture. He argued that Germany had to pause major offensives until production caught up with losses. The panzer forces needed time to rebuild, retrain, and re-equip. Launching attacks with insufficient tanks would only accelerate their destruction. But Hitler's response was chilling. He listened to the reports, studied the charts and graphs, and then calmly dismissed the facts. According to Hitler, the statistics were wrong. German production would soon increase dramatically, not because of factories or resources, but because of sheer willpower and National Socialist determination. Tank losses would decrease because German soldiers were racially superior. The Soviet Union would collapse within months because Bolshevism was inherently weak. Guderian stared at Hitler in disbelief. These weren't hopeful predictions or opinions. Hitler was stating them as absolute facts, ignoring all evidence to the contrary. When Guderian pointed out that tank production had actually been declining for 6 months, Hitler accused him of defeatism and threatened to have him arrested. This was Guderian's moment of clarity. Hitler wasn't just making bad strategic decisions. He was delusional. He had constructed an alternate reality where Nazi ideology dictated outcomes, not industrial capacity, logistics, or battlefield realities. In this fantasy world, willpower and racial superiority trumped math and material facts. For Guderian, serving under such a leader was a nightmare. He realized he was following orders from a man who was not only incompetent, but dangerously detached from reality. Hitler's refusal to accept facts meant that Germany's armored forces were doomed, and with them, the entire war effort. Despite this, Guderian and other commanders had little choice but to obey. The regime's brutal enforcement of loyalty and the threat of punishment kept dissent silent. The Wehrmacht was trapped in a downward spiral, led by a madman whose delusions sealed Germany's fate. This episode wasn't just about tanks or production numbers. It revealed a deeper problem. Hitler's fanatical belief in racial ideology and willpower had replaced rational military planning. The consequences would be catastrophic. As Germany's forces were sent to fight battles, they could no longer win. And this was just one example of how Hitler's detachment from reality was destroying the German war effort from within. The next story shows how this dangerous fantasy extended to the very planning of the invasion of the Soviet Union itself. In early 1941, as Germany prepared for its massive invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was already uneasy. Commanding Army Group South, he was responsible for one of the largest and most critical sectors of the front. But during the planning stages, von Rundstedt dared to ask a question that would reveal just how detached Hitler had become from reality. What if the Soviet Union doesn't collapse quickly after the initial battles? Von Rundstedt asked during a conference. What if the Red Army retreats into the vast interior? What if the war drags on into winter? Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. He looked at von Rundstedt as if the very idea was absurd. The Soviet Union will collapse, he declared with unwavering certainty. We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Von Rundstedt pressed further, trying to inject a dose of realism. He reminded Hitler that the Soviet Union was vast, with millions of soldiers and endless resources. He warned that the harsh Russian winter could cripple the Wehrmacht, just as it had done to Napoleon's army over a century earlier. Hitler's reaction was explosive. He screamed that von Rundstedt was a defeatist, accusing him of treason for even comparing the campaign to Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. According to Hitler, German racial superiority guaranteed victory. The Red Army was weak, cowardly, and incapable of sustained resistance. The war would be over in 6 to 8 weeks. Moscow would fall, and Stalin would either be overthrown or flee. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a dangerous fantasy. Hitler's belief in racial ideology had blinded him to the realities of modern warfare and the resilience of the Soviet people. He refused to consider any scenario that didn't end in swift German victory. Von Rundstedt left the meeting shaken. He understood that Hitler's certainty wasn't based on military intelligence or strategic analysis. It was rooted in ideology and wishful thinking. The Führer was convinced that sheer will and racial destiny would overcome any obstacle. This mindset would have devastating consequences. The German army was not prepared for a prolonged campaign in the vast, harsh terrain of the Soviet Union. Supplies were stretched thin, troops were ill-equipped for winter, and the Soviet forces were far more resilient than Hitler imagined. Von Rundstedt's warnings went unheeded. Instead, Hitler pushed forward with his unrealistic timetable, demanding rapid advances and total victory before winter. When the Wehrmacht stalled and suffered heavy losses, Hitler blamed the generals, accusing them of lacking faith and willpower. This clash between reality and ideology created a dangerous disconnect at the highest levels of command. The generals knew the risks, but Hitler's fanatical certainty left no room for caution or retreat. The result was a series of costly mistakes that bled the German army dry. Von Rundstedt's experience was a clear example of how Hitler's delusions shaped the course of the war. His refusal to accept the possibility of failure turned strategic planning into a fantasy, dooming the campaign before it truly began. And this was just one of many moments when Hitler's detachment from reality forced his commanders into impossible situations. The next story reveals how this madness reached its darkest point during the brutal siege of Stalingrad. The winter of 1942-1943 marked one of the darkest chapters in the history of the German Wehrmacht, centered on the brutal siege of Stalingrad. At the heart of this catastrophe was General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, trapped and encircled by Soviet forces in a frozen, desperate city. Paulus was a loyal officer, known for his obedience and discipline, but even he would face a moment that shattered any illusions about the Führer's sanity. By January 1943, the situation was dire. The Sixth Army was surrounded, starving, freezing, and cut off from any hope of relief. Yet, despite the hopelessness, Paulus clung to the belief that Hitler's promises of reinforcements and relief would come true. He followed orders without question, maintaining faith in the Führer's leadership even as his men suffered. Then came January 24th, 1943, a day that would haunt Paulus for the rest of his life. On that day, he received a promotion to field marshal. At first glance, it seemed like a reward for his service. But the message behind the promotion was far more sinister. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was a thinly veiled command. Paulus was expected to die rather than capitulate, to take the entire Sixth Army down with him. Paulus sat in his frozen basement headquarters, reading the promotion order while outside. His soldiers were dying of starvation and cold. The message was clear. Hitler cared more about preserving the myth of German invincibility than about the lives of tens of thousands of men. Rather than allowing a breakout or surrender when resistance was clearly futile, Hitler demanded a theatrical death, a final act of loyalty to the Nazi cause. This was the moment Paulus understood the true nature of Hitler's madness. The Führer wasn't making military decisions based on strategy or the welfare of his troops. He was sacrificing an entire army for symbolism, living in a fantasy where gestures and mythology mattered more than human lives. Despite the pressure, Paulus made a choice that shocked the Nazi leadership. He surrendered. Refusing to participate in what he saw as a death cult, Paulus chose to save what was left of his men, even if it meant defying Hitler's explicit orders. This decision haunted him, but it was a clear rejection of the Führer's delusions. The fall of the Sixth Army was a turning point in the war and a devastating blow to German morale. It exposed the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's detachment from reality and his willingness to sacrifice millions for ideology and pride. Paulus's experience was a stark reminder that the madness at the top was not just about poor strategy or fanaticism. It was about a leader who had lost touch with humanity itself. The war was no longer about winning. It was about clinging to a fantasy, even as the world around them crumbled. And while Paulus's surrender marked a rare moment of defiance, many other generals continued to follow Hitler's insane orders, trapped by fear, loyalty, or the hope that somehow the madness would end, but it wouldn't. The next chapter reveals how even the most celebrated commanders, like Rommel, faced the harsh truth of Hitler's delusions and the impossible choices that came with it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, famously known as the Desert Fox, was one of Nazi Germany's most celebrated commanders. His victories in North Africa had made him a propaganda icon, admired even by his enemies for his tactical brilliance and leadership. But beneath the surface of his public image, Rommel was a practical soldier who understood the harsh realities of war, realities that Hitler was increasingly unwilling to face. After the crushing defeat in North Africa, Rommel was reassigned to inspect Germany's coastal defenses in France. The Allies were preparing for a massive invasion, and Rommel's task was to assess the situation and prepare for what was expected to be the decisive battle of the war. What he found was deeply troubling. Rommel's reports were clear and urgent. Germany lacked the resources to defend the entire Atlantic coastline effectively. The vast length of the coast was impossible to hold with the limited troops available. Allied air superiority meant that moving reserves quickly would be nearly impossible once the invasion began. The only realistic hope was to stop the invasion on the beaches within the first 48 hours, before the Allies could establish a foothold. But when Rommel presented these assessments to Hitler, his warnings were dismissed outright. The Führer insisted that German forces would easily repel any invasion attempt. He claimed that Allied soldiers were weak and cowardly, and that secret wonder weapons would turn the tide in Germany's favor. These weapons, jets, rockets, and advanced submarines, were either still in prototype stages or hadn't even been built yet. Rommel tried to impress upon Hitler the scale of the Allied preparations. Intelligence showed millions of troops and thousands of ships gathering for the invasion, but Hitler waved this off as Allied disinformation, refusing to accept the reality of the threat. Rommel's frustration grew as he realized that Hitler was living in a fantasy world, where wishful thinking and propaganda replaced sound military judgment. The Führer's obsession with miracle weapons and destiny blinded him to the very real dangers facing Germany. The final blow to Rommel's hopes came during a meeting in March 1944. Fresh from inspecting the Atlantic Wall defenses, Rommel urged Hitler to seek a political settlement with the Western Allies. He argued that Germany should concentrate its forces against the Soviet Union, which posed the greater existential threat. But Hitler was unmoved. Instead, Hitler launched into a 2-hour monologue about destiny, providence, and the miraculous weapons that would soon save Germany. He described jets and rockets that would destroy Allied bombing fleets and sink invasion armadas, insisting that production was ramping up to flood the battlefield with these game-changing technologies. Rommel sat silently, listening to fantasies presented as operational plans. He understood that Hitler had completely detached from reality. The Führer inhabited a delusional world where hope and ideology replaced facts and military analysis. Rommel left that meeting knowing the truth. Germany was doomed. The war was lost, not just because of the overwhelming power of the Allies, but because its leader was trapped in a dangerous fantasy. Hitler's refusal to face reality had sealed the fate of the Reich. This wasn't just a failure of strategy, it was a collapse of leadership at the highest level. And for Rommel, a soldier who valued pragmatism and honor, it was a bitter and painful realization. What came next would show how Hitler's physical and mental decline only deepened his detachment from reality, pushing Germany further down the path to destruction. By 1943 and 1944, those closest to Adolf Hitler could no longer ignore the terrifying signs of his physical and mental deterioration. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who would later become infamous for his attempt to assassinate Hitler, had regular access to the Führer's conferences during this period. What he witnessed was a man unraveling before their very eyes. Hitler's health was visibly collapsing. His tremors worsened month by month. His left hand shook so violently that he often had to hold it with his right hand just to steady it. His left leg dragged noticeably when he walked, a sign of the Parkinson's-like symptoms that plagued him. His face had taken on a grayish pallor, and he was hunched over, looking far older than his 54 years. But the most disturbing change was in his eyes. They had become glassy and unfocused, sometimes rolling back during meetings, as if he was somewhere else entirely. The legacy of this period is complex and painful. It forces us to examine how institutions and individuals respond when faced with leadership that is not only flawed, but dangerously unwell. It challenges us to consider the moral responsibilities of those in power and those who serve them. How much should loyalty demand? When does obedience become complicity? And what is the cost of denial? History shows us that the collapse of reason at the top can have devastating ripple effects, not just on armies and nations, but on millions of innocent lives. The story of Hitler and his generals is a stark reminder that leadership requires more than authority. It demands wisdom, courage, and above all, a connection to reality. As we reflect on these events, it's crucial to remember the human cost behind the strategies and battles. The soldiers who froze and starved, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and the countless lives shattered by decisions made in a world detached from truth. This chapter of history remains a warning for all times. It reminds us that no matter how powerful a leader may seem, their decisions must be questioned, their actions held accountable, and their grip on reality constantly tested. Because when madness goes unchecked, the consequences are nothing short of apocalyptic. So as we close this story, consider this. The tragedy of Nazi Germany was not just the result of war or ideology, but the failure of leadership and the silence of those who could have stopped it. It's a lesson etched in history, urging us to stay vigilant, to speak out, and to never let reason be drowned out by delusion.